Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm your host, and today we're going to be having a little bit of fun, but it's going to be fun in a serious way, serious in a fun way. We're going to be exploring the question, has craft chocolate become boring? Now, let me know in the comments. So you can go to the live chat on YouTube or the comments in LinkedIn and Facebook and let me know what you think. Do you think craft chocolate has become boring? If yes, why do you think that way? And if you don't think craft chocolate is boring, let me know why you think craft chocolate is not boring. But I'm going to dive into my thesis after one more bit of housekeeping, which is to let you know that this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, is sponsored by the members of the Chocolate Life. This is the homepage of the Chocolate Life. And if you're not a member, you can go click on the join button. It says account here, but there's a join button if you're not logged in. You can go click on the join button and become a member, right? There's always been a free membership tier, but if you do have the financial resources to support the work that we do, we don't take, network advertising. I don't have a separate Patreon account. I'm not doing YouTube monetization or anything like that. You can go and support the work I do for as little as $5 a month. And I want to thank all of my free subscribers and all of my premium members who provide me with the resources to do the work that I do. And with that, let's jump in. So for every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, I create a post. And this is the post for today's episode. And the title has Craft Chocolate Become Boring? Now, I do realize that this title is a little clickbaity, right? And so are you here because you wanted to know what I was going to talk about? Did the clickbait work? Again, what do you think? Has craft chocolate become boring? If yes, why? If no, why not? But I want to go through my thesis here. And the post is a run of show. So it really is a discussion of like the order I'm going to do things, because these episodes are not scripting. But I have mentioned in the past, and it's important, that whenever you see a headline, right, whenever you see a question mark at the end of a headline, like has craft chocolate become boring? Question, right? I am going to, I just wanted just a quick shout out to a longtime member and supporter of the Chocolate Life, who says I'm going back to exciting Hershey bars now. Thank you very much for giving me a laugh at the very, very start of the episode. It's very, very much, very, very much appreciated, Kurt. Thank you very, very much. But there is something which is called Betteridge's Law. And Betteridge's Law says that whenever you see a headline that ends in a question mark, you should just assume that the answer is no. And if you want to learn more about it, there's a link to a Wikipedia article that does talk about it. But it says Betteridge Law is an adage that states any headline that ends in a question mark can be answered by the word no. It is based on the assumption that if the publishers were confident the answer was yes, they would have presented it as an assertion. By presenting it as a question, they are not accountable for whether it is correct or not. Well, in this particular case, I am going to hold myself accountable, but I wanted to highlight the question. And the reason why I wanted to talk about it today is I've had this story in my drafts folder for quite some time because I was on a call with a colleague several years ago, and the question came up about whether it was possible to create a new style of craft chocolate. And that turns out to be a less straightforward question than you might think it was, because there are at least three different things we need to talk about, but we need to tease apart what do we mean when we say craft chocolate. And this is, I don't want to get into definitional fights at all, but I think it's really important that if we're going to use a word like craft, a phrase like craft chocolate, that we actually know what it is that we're talking about, or that if you're speaking with somebody, that you are working from a shared definition. Because if you're talking to people and each of you has a different definition, you end up talking past each other, and there's no resolution to anything, because you're saying something and it seems to be obvious to you, and somebody else is looking at you and you go, well, I use the word in a slightly different way, so it's not obvious to me. So it turns out that this question of what do we mean by craft chocolate and what do we mean by style those are two really interesting questions that we need to get to the answer to before we can even begin to answer the question of, is it possible to create a new style of craft chocolate? Okay, so what does style mean when it comes to chocolate? And so is the word style synonymous with type? And we'll get into that along with trying to decompose those. And to answer the other question is, why does it matter? I've already talked a little bit about why it matters, because if you're talking with people and you have different definitions, then you're talking past each other. And this is something that the industry, which I just prefer to call specialty chocolate, because I think it's more, well, because pragmatically, the reason why I think specialty chocolate is better is because the specialty coffee world has already done a really good job of defining what a specialty coffee bean is and what a specialty coffee beverage is. And the parallels in chocolate are very, very similar. And it means that in chocolate, we can build upon the decades of work that the specialty coffee industry has done, trying to help people understand what they mean. So that's one of the reasons. That's why I prefer specialty over craft or bean to bar. And we'll get through all of those things in just a bit, in a bit more detail. Okay, so in what ways, before we get to that, in what ways has craft chocolate become boring? So a little bit more history on this before I get into that questions, right? Well, Kurt, Starbucks is specialty, I agree that that Starbucks uses specialty beans. I don't know that 100% of the beans that they use are specialty. I know that some of the beans are specialty, as defined by Q grading scores, which is the way it works. But I'm not gonna argue that point right. I'm not gonna argue that point right now. I would say that perhaps compared with Dutch Brothers or Dunkin' or any other sort of mass coffee brand, maybe there is a distinction. But the fact that they have this roasting style that you may or may not like, that's a personal preference thing. I mean, you can buy a specialty coffee bean and burn it. You can buy a specialty cocoa bean and burn it. I mean, but it is actually something that does need to be addressed. So thanks for pointing out. It's not the question I was prepared to answer, though. So maybe I will have a chance to noodle on it over the course of the hour as I go through. So, but what I want to do is when we talk about, so here's a phrase that I wrote. So I wrote this first paragraph, and it didn't occur to me until after I wrote it, right? And then I thought about it, okay? Which is, since back in the late 1990s, when bean-to-bar chocolate leapt into the collective consciousness, after Scharfenberger opened its doors, the emerging craft chocolate industry has struggled to define itself, right? And it's one of the reasons why I prefer the term specialty, right? But what I wanted to point out is that the equivocation here, we're conflating bean-to-bar and craft. And the question is, are they synonyms, right? I would say no. I don't think that bean-to-bar and craft are synonymous, but it is this conflation, right? And it is in general conflating things, conflating terms is a problem that we have. So much of the definition of craft chocolate is framed in opposition to industrial or big chocolate. So craft chocolate is the opposite of whatever it is that big chocolate does. And to some extent, that's also true of bean to bar. The original definition that John Scharfenberger and Robert Steinberg had for bean to bar very, very much were sort of in opposition to what it was that big companies like Valrhona were doing, right? That there was a sense of deliberation and intent that a bean to bar maker had that a big chocolate maker didn't have. So, and we might break these down. So big chocolate uses lots of ingredients that aren't strictly necessary, right? So a lot of craft chocolate is made from only 2 or at most 3 ingredients. Big chocolate uses a variety of blending techniques that are useful when consistent flavor, rheology, pH, or some other factor is desirable. Most craft chocolate makers perform no blending of any sort whatsoever. I think that's a mistake. You could have, 4 bags from the same harvest year from the same producer. And it looks like my video froze for a second on my end. I hope the audio came through, but you could have 4 bags from the same harvest from the same producer. And if you blended the bags together, what you do is you'd get rid of small bag to bag differences, which are often pretty inevitable, right? If you were to take 4 different roasts, each one of, no matter how good you are at doing them, there are going to be slight differences. You could blend the roasts together. If you had 3 different Melanger batches, you could mix the Melanger batches. So it's all still, one bean, right? And so the single origin nature of all of this is the same. But by not blending, what you're doing is you're saying, okay, I can blend out the small batch to batch differences. And so instead of having a 35 kilo batch, maybe what it is, my definition is now, 5 Melanger loads, it's 150 kilos. That's the only thing that it does. So there are places where blending, in my opinion, doesn't go against any of the ethos, any of the precepts that many craft / bean to bar makers have, right? So, and also, big chocolate is mostly uninterested in flavors other than chocolate in the chocolate, right? So if you are a craft chocolate maker, you're a bean to bar maker, what you're trying to do is you're trying to maximize the flavor expression of the beans that you have, not turn any bean that you've got into, right, the same flavor profile over and over and over again, right? So like all generalizations, these are generalizations, but as with most stereotypes, generalizations, there is some basis in fact for arriving at them. So if you were to carefully survey the offerings from thousands of craft chocolate browns around the world, so estimates are 3,000 to 5,000 small makers around the world. Unfortunately, as an industry, we don't know how many they are, where they are located, how much cocoa they buy, how much chocolate they make, what the economic value of their efforts is. So there's no way to characterize how big the industry is. There's just a fundamental lack of knowledge. And the organizations which appear to be interested in organizing and promoting this segment so far don't appear to have any interest in gathering that data, which I think is unfortunate. But so it is a generalization. But what I want to suggest, right, is that if you go take a look at like the International Chocolate Awards, and you were to go like the World Awards for 25, 24, 23, they're easily available on the ICA website. And you just count down the number of plain origin dark bars there are, right? The total number of winners, both gold, bronze, and silver, right? And then you compare the total number of awards with the awards in any other category. What you find is that there is a sameness to things, right? That what it is that the gatekeepers, to some extent, the people who run the awards programs, right, are rewarding is a particular type of chocolate, a dark chocolate bar and a plain, right, origin. So an origin bar, meaning where the beans came from, are displayed on the packaging, right? And so in that respect, there is a certain sameness about what the industry is promoting. And that sameness, right, can lead to boring, because if that's what it is that the industry gatekeepers, the awards programs, are rewarding preferentially, then there is pressure for every maker to produce those bars and get them into the competition, right? And as a judge at the International Chocolate Awards, so I have judged for the International Chocolate Awards in the USA rounds, usually in the finals of the USA rounds. I never was a triage judge in the Americas round. And I've also judged at the world's finals judging rounds in London. So I have done that on a number of years. Haven't done it. Last time I was a judge for the ICAs was in 2017 in Peru. But I would, as a judge, I can tell you, I dreaded as a judge. I want to go do something and just let you know, right? Because I'm going to solo my face here, right? As a judge, I dreaded the parts of the competition where we would be handed a plate of 9 70% two ingredient chocolates from Peru, or 70% two ingredient chocolates made from beans from Ecuador, right? Or 70% two ingredient chocolates made from beans from Madagascar, right? Because at this point, you're just, what are the differences between them, right? There's a sameness to them, right? And I have made the point before is that the last thing the world needs is another 70% two ingredient chocolate made from the Bajofo estate in Madagascar. There are so many differences. I mean, if you're a maker, you're looking at it and going, well, everybody has to do Madagascar, so I'm going to go use this estate beans. But you really need to understand as a maker what it is that you're bringing to the table that's different and or better. Now, it would make sense for you to buy the beans and experiment with them, right? So here are 10 other people who are using, quote unquote, the same beans, right? It'll, again, differences from bag to bag even, right? But you want to know, you want to have your own experience with working with those beans, right? And figuring out, oh, can I do something which other people haven't done? Rather than the reflexive, I'm going to buy the beans, I'm going to make something, and I'm going to put it out there, right? And that's one of the ways in which craft chocolate has become boring, right? That that there is to some extent, right, not enough diversity in terms of bean sources, and so what you end up with is a lot of people who are going to many makers using the same suppliers, who are using the same beans, and they're using the same processing technology. I've got a melanger, and the melanger is going to produce chocolate for the most part that is different from what you might expect to get out of, for example, a ball mill. There are textural differences that if you're trained, you can understand them. I was at the Douwes Wiener factory in outside of Amsterdam, trying to remember when it was. And I was in a conference room and they handed me 2 chocolates, identical recipes. So the beans, big batch of beans, roasted, then split, and then mixed. All of that stuff was the same, but they put one of them through a ball mill line and the other one through a roll mill line. And, if you're not looking for it, you're never going to see the difference you're never going to taste the difference. But if somebody sits down and says, point out, here's the textural difference, right? They're going to be different. So if you're using the same beans, right, the same approach to roasting, you've gone to school on John Nancy's roasting technique from Chocolate Alchemy. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying if everybody is using the same beans, following the same roasting protocol, is using the same melangers and doing it, there is a sameness there, right? And so that is one respect in which, okay, craft chocolate, right, can become, or there is a not a pressure, but there is a path, right, that you need to be aware of and decide that you're consciously following it or that you're going to do something different, right? So you're going to do a 70% two ingredient because why? You're not adding cocoa butter because why, right? I have often said, and I say this in my chocolate making classes, start out making a 5 ingredient chocolate: cocoa beans, sugar, cocoa butter, lecithin, and vanilla. Start out with a 5 ingredient chocolate, right? Then the next batch is remove one of the ingredients, usually lecithin or vanilla, and then make another batch and remove another one of the ingredients. So you go from a 5 ingredient chocolate to a 4 ingredient chocolate, all the way down to actually you could just do a 1 ingredient chocolate, just the nibs and unsweetened chocolate. And develop an understanding for why you're doing what it is that you're doing, right? And then understanding that you're actually making a creative choice as a creative choice, not because, oh, well, this company won a lot of awards using these beans and they did a 2 ingredient chocolate, so I'm going to do the same thing. That's boring. That's boring, right? I can tell you that as a judge, it's boring. Now, I'm not always a judge, right? And for me, as a judge, and it has taken over the way I taste chocolate, whether I'm in a professional setting or a personal setting. Right? I try to think, I try to separate, is this a well-made example of what it is that I'm tasting? And do I like it? Those are two very different things. And that's not something that generally an uneducated consumer, somebody who walks into a store, sees 8 single origin Madagascar bars, all at 70%. Some of them have award stickers, some of them have multiple award stickers, some of them don't. How do you figure out what to do? How do you figure out which ones to purchase? And the answer is you have to buy all of them, or at least 2 of them, and decide which ones you prefer. But not everybody's going to do that, right? It might be intellectually interesting to compare the same beans turned into chocolate by different makers, right? But the actual tasting experience is often marred by suboptimal chocolate making skills. Now, one of the things that I can confidently say is that when I was a judge back in 2008, 2009, 2010, in the earlier days of craft chocolate, that the number of badly made chocolate bars, so not very good examples of its type, has reduced in proportion pretty significantly. As a judge in the Craft Chocolate Challenge, for example, over the course of the 4 years that I've been a judge, there has been a marked decrease in the number of bars where you put them in your mouth and you go, I'm not going to finish this, right? So there is that, right? And we need to take that into account, right? But, right, if you're a chocolate maker, try hard not to be boring. If you're going to be using the same beans, find something to do, right, that's going to make what it is that you're doing stand out, right? If everybody else is making a 70% 2-ingredient single origin from a single estate in Madagascar, maybe a way not to be boring is to find another estate in Madagascar, or use another producing country, or don't do a 2-ingredient bar, right? There are lots of ways to go about not being boring. Think about what that is. Right? Another thing, there are a bunch of questions that I post, that I put in the post, right? And so what does craft signal compared with non-craft, right? So this is a question that's been going on for 20 years now, right? What does artisan chocolate signal? All right. And how is artisan the same or different from craft? I went down a rabbit hole in which I said, okay, right, what is craft, and what is the consensus definition for what craft is? And I'm going to get to that, right? We also have this question about bean to bar. Is bean to bar meaningful? It meant something in '96 when Scharfenberger coined it and started promoting it. But when Ghirardelli, which is owned by Lindt, started saying, proudly bean to bar, our commitment to ultimate quality, right? Did bean to bar stop becoming a really useful, meaningful differentiator, right? If Ghirardelli, which is owned by Lindt, which is one of the top 10 candy companies, candy snack companies in the world, if they can use the phrase bean to bar, how does an individual chocolate maker differentiate their use of the word bean to bar from what it is that Ghirardelli's use of the bean to bar? And this is going to become important, and I'm sitting here making the connection in my mind, is that this coming Friday, I'm going to be doing a first look at a new bit of research, which was published by the Institute for Chocolate and Cocoa Research, Cocoa and Chocolate. I don't know what the order is. I forget what the order is right now. Out of Harvard, they've done a specialty chocolate survey of the U.S. of 1,000 specialty chocolate people, right? People, self-identified specialty chocolate consumers is probably the best way to describe it. And this notion that I just brought up is a really interesting question to ask in that light. And I'm going to be exploring that this coming Friday. Right. But again, what we've got with, what does craft mean? What does bean to bar mean? Right. And a lot of it has to do with, identifying, if I'm a specialty chocolate consumer and self-identified, and I self-identify with a certain level of knowledge, then how does that have an impact on all of the other responses I'm going to give in the survey? It's an interesting question, right? So again, the opposite side of this is, in what ways is craft chocolate not boring, right? And so I don't want to get into an unproductive argument. I'm not going to go into detail. People are not saying, Clay, I think your definition for craft, right, which I haven't defined so far, right? Although I have defined specialty, and yes, Kurt, right? Starbucks can be called specialty, right? It's like, okay, how do you define craft beer, right? Well, I've got a craft brewery, and it's defined for the most part by how much do you produce and who owns you. And the definition of, you're a craft brewer if you produce under a certain number of barrels per year and you have less than a certain amount of beneficial ownership by a big company that owns like other beer brands, right? And that's we can debate whether it's useful or not, if it's meaningful or not. That's what beer does. I don't think there's any room in chocolate for differentiation between who is craft and who is not based upon how much you produce. Oh, you're a craft chocolate maker if you process 200 tons of beans a year or less, but you're a craft chocolate manufacturer, right, if you process more than 200 metric tons a year. So what happens if somebody produces 199, or someone processes 199, or somebody processes 201? I mean, that window is just too narrow. And is there anything functionally different between those two? It's an arbitrary barrier that no one has agreed on yet. And it's an open question. I don't like it. And one of the reasons why I don't like it is it's the same question in beer, right? So you're a craft brewer if you make less than 50,000 barrels a year. But if you make 51,000 barrels a year, you're no longer craft. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, right? So I'm not going to go into too much depth. Let's talk about craft and artisan, though, because I want to inject them into here, because I don't think craft and bean to bar are synonymous. So bean to bar is just a statement of process. I start with beans and I end with bars, right? And if I just leave it at that, it's very, very clear and very, very simple. What the challenge is, right, is that when you try to layer judgment calls on top of craft, you are a craft chocolate maker if you work from beans, right, and you end up with bars, and you use sustainable cocoa, or you use fine flavor cocoa, or you use direct trade cocoa, right? There are, ethical questions, ethical in the sense that, is this ethically justified? There are questions about, do these make sense? But now what we're doing is we're taking a very, very simple process definition, right? And we're conflating all these other terms on top of it that are talking about other dimensions, right, of the business, right? And I think it makes a lot more sense, right, to be able to say just bean to bar is process. You are bean to bar if you start with beans, you end with bars, right? You can be a nib to bar maker, you can be a liquor to bar maker. I mean, there is a very, very clear pathway here, right, to differentiate what bean to bar is, as opposed to a confectioner, a chocolatier, right, who buys in ready-made couverture. That is a very, very simple, bright line differentiation. It's not quite so clear yet in tree to bar or farm to bar, because there's lots of conflations of ownership. You can only be a farm to bar chocolate maker if you own the farm and you actively farm, right? And the workshop is on the farm. And you have to satisfy all of those three criteria to be a farm to bar maker. Number one, we have to get broad industry agreement that that's we're going to agree on that definition. And then once you've done that, you can say, okay, here's the subjective definition. Now we can objectively say, do you meet the criteria? Right? But that's a lot more challenging. We need to recognize that, that we're making a conscious decision about which aspects of this we're going to throw into our basic definition. So I'm going to say bean to bar is a simple process of definition. But I think that craft is going to be sort of a linear definition, right? It's not a straight, binary. I am bean to bar, yes or no, right? For craft sits on a continuum in the way I think about it. That's at one end is craft, and the other end is industrial. Right? And what happens, right? The difference is the industrial maker starts off with the end goal in mind, right? Because their customers demand consistency. So an industrial maker says, we've been making this same chocolate for the last 40 years. Our customers buy it. Oh, I use, number 803, right? And they know that if they buy number 803, it will work exactly the same way. It'll taste the same. It will have the same rheology. It will have the same pH, right? They can use it confident with that there is no need to change their recipes or their machinery, right? And that is sort of the definition of industrial consistency. Consistency is the hallmark of industrial production, right? At the other end, you have a craft maker, right? And it's not a binary, right? You can, different parts of the process can be different ways, or you could be an industrial maker, but have a craft product, and you could have you could be a craft maker, but maybe also what you do is you have a couverture product line, and your customers of your couverture product line are expecting consistency. But craft starts off, and it says a craft maker is not concerned as much with absolute consistency, that they're looking at a new bag of beans and they see it as a new creative opportunity for flavor expression. And so that continuum is intent with, my intent is consistency when I start, right? My intent is not consistency when I start. Right? And so that's a really good way of thinking about craft. I hope you'll agree. If you disagree, let me know. Put it in the comments. And Clay, no, but what about? Right? So I want to do a companion definition, which I think often gets, again, conflated or lumped in with craft chocolate, and that is artisan. So craft and artisan tend to be used synonymously. They're the same thing. And what I want to suggest is that, number one, they're not. Craft and artisan are not synonymous, right? Especially in chocolate, right? But what we can do is we can look at them as a continuum in the same way we look at craft industrial, right? And what we do is we set up a continuum that says artisan industrial, and that rather than intent as being what it is that we're measuring, right? The metric that we're looking at across the continuum, we look at labor. So an industrial chocolate maker tries to reduce the amount of labor as much as possible, right? They're just maximizing mechanization because the cost of labor is what they can control. They can't control the cost of ingredients, right? So what they're trying really hard to do is we're industrial because, we just pour beans at one end and it doesn't get touched by human hands until we have chocolate out the other end, a chocolate bar often wrapped at the other end, and I've seen that, I was at the Felkland factory in Schwyz in 2008, and once they put the beans into the machinery that led to the roasters, there was almost no hand involvement. Everything was moved around and pumped around, right? That was less so of their Grand Cru line, which is important to know, and that's why it's a continuum, and it's based around product lines, right? But for an artisan producer, right, labor is often a badge of honor. We spend time individually, visually inspecting every single one of our cocoa beans, and if we find anything that we think looks like any kind of defect, we're going to set it aside. And there is an equation that said more labor equal higher quality, right? And that's the other end of the spectrum. Artisan is, we don't care, the cost of labor is not a primary concern, right? And at the other end, industrial, the cost of labor is in fact the primary concern. We can think about it that way. So what does it mean to be a craft chocolate in that context? And what I'm going to suggest that what it means to be a craft chocolate maker in this context is that, number one, right, your goal is to maximize the expression of flavor using the beans on hand. However you're going to do this, you could start from beans, right? You could start, that's fine. You could be a bean to bar maker. I mean, but you're looking, you're selecting beans, you're selecting your roast profile, all that kind of stuff. And you look at it and you say, I want to do something interesting with these beans. And that's a way in which craft is not boring, right? Because it's all about trying to do something different, something unique, something new, something unusual with the beans you have, right? Industrial chocolate is boring because the goal is to do the same thing every single time. Right? And so I think that's a useful definition. So we have David Briceño Puentes. I think David is from Colombia, as I recall. We've met, we've chatted in the past, but it's been a while since we've corresponded. I think it's fair. Industrial makes everything fit the desired output. Craft starts from the beans. So David, what I want to do is I want to push back a little bit about this, because a lot of people will say to me, hey, Clay, there's nothing creative about industrial chocolate. And I have to push back on that particular point, which is in the recipe development process, that is fundamentally a creative process, right? A customer comes to you with a challenge. They want a chocolate that tastes a particular way. They want a chocolate that behaves a particular way in their machinery or in baking or whatever application they have. And that is fundamentally a creative process. We need to take beans from this place and roast them this way, and beans from this place and roast them that way. And we need to blend them in a particular way. They might have different cocoa butter with different melting points. One might be a soft butter. Another one could be a hard butter. So we need to throw in another butter or an emulsifier, right? In order to get the texture that we want, right? So I think that's fundamentally a creative process. But once you've gone through that process, the moment you put it into production, we need to do this every single time exactly the same way, every single time exactly the same way, right? And so they both start from the beans. They have to start from the beans, right? It's about what happens when you go into production. I mean, the thing about a craft maker, right, and this is where artisan overlaps with craft and it becomes a little blurry, is that a craft maker can go in and because they're interested in flavor expression, what they could do is they could sleep by their melanger. And this is something I know from visiting the Felkman factory in Switzerland. They bought a couple of old style Lehman longitudinal conchas. I said melangers. I said melangers, but I meant conchas. They bought a couple of old style Lehman melangers, and the chocolate maker literally slept by the melanger during the initial test runs, because the 68-hour mark might be at 4 o'clock in the morning. And so they're getting up in order to taste. I mean, they're tasting it every single hour in the conch in order to figure out at what point do we start losing the volatile aromatic compounds that make the chocolate interesting. At what point does the texture change into something that we don't like anymore? And so we're going to pull back, right? And we're going to say, well, 68 hours is better than 72 hours, but everybody is saying 72 hours is always better than 68 because it's longer. Well, no, it's not longer. It's just more expensive. And if you overconch, you're producing a lower quality product in terms of the eating experience. So craft starts with a bean, industrial starts with a bean. They both start with beans, right? It's how the process changes when they get into production. The craft chocolate maker can say, it's done. I'm going to pull it after 45 hours rather than 48 hours. Or they can say at 48 hours, it's not quite done. I'm going to go another 2 hours. Or, I'm going to raise the temperature a couple of degrees, or it needs to be cooler, right? So the craft maker, among other things, is making decisions a la minute, in the minute, during the process, right, which affect the entire outcome. And the nature of industrial processing is it's really, really hard. to the point of being next to impossible, to making those kinds of adjustments in the middle of a batch. And so let's think about that, right? You also like the machinery ingredients are not specific in this approach. Absolutely. Absolutely. We haven't said anything about the machinery. I can be an industrial chocolate maker in melangers if what it is that my goal is to make the same chocolate every single time. I can be industrial chocolate maker in ball mills, in roll mills, in universals. I can be industrial maker. But I could be a craft maker and have a melanger, but I could also have a roll mill. I could also have a ball mill. I could have a combination of those three things, because that's really cool, because now I get to think about how the order and which machines are involved affect the output of what it is that I'm doing. I might have a separate conch. I may be conching in a melanger. I mean, or the universal. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to do it. So the definition of craft should have nothing to do with machinery. The definition of craft should have nothing to do with how much you produce, right? You can't say, well, you're a craft maker until 200 metric tons of beans processed, and anything over that, you're an industrial producer. That makes no sense whatsoever. It's about intent, right? And then, so craft is, right, about, maximizing the flavor expression of beans, right? Or making it taste the same way every single time starting out, right? And artisan is how much labor is involved. At one end, industrial says, I'm trying to minimize the cost of labor. And at the artisan end, it says, I might wear doing something in a really tedious, time-consuming, expensive kind of way, like bean inspection, and wear it as a badge of honor. I'm not making a value judgment there. And we shouldn't make value judgments based on this, right? It's still the question of, do I like what they produce? I mean, are they making good examples of what they're saying they're making? So it's really, really important that what we do is we deconstruct all these different axes, all these different judgments where they're making, like some of them are hedonic, right? Like the way it tastes, or, some of them are based in process, some of them are based in ethical concerns, and just separate them and realize that, bean to bar says, I start with beans, I end with bars, right? It doesn't matter if I'm doing it 5 kilos at a time or 5,000 kilos at a time. I start with beans, I end with bars. And now what I can do is I can start tagging that with descriptors, right? Oh, I'm a craft bean to bar maker. All right, well, what that tells me, right, is that I approach each new batch of beans as a new opportunity for creative expression. Or in general, my goal is to maximize the expression of flavor with whatever it is that I'm doing, right? I can be an industrial bean to bar maker, right? And my goal is, listen, I've been making a chocolate that tastes this way, the same way for the last 40 years. And my goal is to make the chocolate taste exactly the same way in the next batch. Why? Because my customers demand it, right? You could say a craft chocolate maker, their customers they don't demand consistency. So I'm trying really, really hard to make that differentiation. And so, I spent quite a bit of time yesterday and even more time this morning going over that. So I have told people, I have made it well known that I do use the assistance of an LLM. Actually, several LLMs. Sometimes I will use one LLM to fact check another LLM. They've been trained differently, or they've been trained on different corpi. And so you can take the output of one LLM, use it as the input of another LLM, and say, fact check this. And because their models are slightly different, you will get different answers. So I do use LLMs, but the one I use most often, Claude now, over ChatGPT or Gemini for a bunch of different reasons. But the LLM, the Claude that I use, and I do this within projects. So I do all this work within projects. So there's a lot of memory and history associated with the project. And there are common skills and other things which are shared among all of the work that I do. But this is based on now almost 2 years. I don't know this that long, well over a year of working with Claude. And it's trained on me. It's trained on the 25 years of experience that I have and my approach with respect to skepticism and critical thinking. So this is the way I do it. And then I take very, very little at face value, right? I will go and fact check it. Often I will generate, I will generate some text, put it into a post like this one today. And then what I will do is I will ask the LLM to fact check the post, say, am I misrepresenting anything? So I'm very, very careful in the way I use these things. And it's relatively easy to get things back on track if things appear to be if there is a signal, there appears to be noise in the signal. There's an outlier. It doesn't make sense. I just wanted to say that. So I did ask the question, can you develop a consensus around what craft chocolate means? And so the consensus, craft chocolate is, quote, chocolate made by a single producer who controls the whole process from raw cacao to finished bar, not melted down couverture bought from an industrial supplier, in small batches from traceable high quality cacao that's been properly fermented and dried at origin. So I looked, there are over 30 different sources that went through, and they got the definition. They got the separate definitions of what craft chocolate meant. And this is what the synthesis of the consensus of all those sources were. But take a look about conflation, right? So craft chocolate is chocolate made by a single producer who controls the whole process, right? So, okay, so chocolate made by a single producer. But at this point, how do we distinguish craft from bean to bar? We can't do that, right? In small batches, well, that's an ethos judgment, right? So is craft chocolate necessarily small batch? Maybe not. I mean, define the size of the batch for me first. If you say small batch is anything under, anything under 100 kilos, right? That's the definition of craft. If I've got a machine and I do 500 kilos, right? That's no longer craft. I mean, so we're conflating, right, a size constraint with the base definition. Doesn't work, right? From traceable high quality cacao, this for me is wrong. I can be a craft chocolate maker working with commodity beans. I got commodity beans. I'm working from West Africa. I mean, I had a conversation with Dave Menkes at Letterpress before it sadly closed down. And David said, "Do you know what my number one selling bar is?" And it's my Ghana bar, right? And his number two selling bar was Ghana with salt. But why? And the Ghana beans were commodity beans, right? They weren't specialty beans. And he said people like it because they'll come in and they'll see the Ucayali River. So I think I was with David at the Salon du Chocolat. I may have met him on a trip, and we went to Ucayali River. I believe that's the case. I'm hoping that I remember that properly. But they taste the Ucayali, and it's like nothing they've ever tasted before. But the Ghana bean, right, is very, very familiar, and they will like what it is that's familiar. And so at the time at Letterpress, the Ghana bar was their number one selling bar. So the moment we say from traceable high quality cacao, well, that's not what it means to be craft, right? These are modifiers that we're attaching to craft, right, which don't make any sense. And we have to be careful when we conflate them. However, there is some peer-reviewed research. There is a recently published peer-reviewed article in the journal Comprehensive Reviews in Food Science and Food Safety. There's a link to that article if you want to read it. It's interesting. For apropos of nothing, it was the authors are all Brazilian academics, right? But this peer-reviewed article frames it almost identically. Small batch from a specific origin, made with traditional methods. What we're using metates, right? That's a traditional method. So do I have to use metate, right? It has to be stone on stone? Can I use a ball mill? When we think about tradition, how far back do we go to determine if something is traditional, right? So that's an interesting question, right? Free of quality degrading additives. There's a hedonic judgment, if I can say, What is sugar a quality degrading additive? Is vanilla always a quality degrading additive? Can we use that in the definition of craft, right? But shaped by the producer's own skill and taste. Absolutely, right? So for a bunch of people, craft is as much about process integrity as it is about flavor. Others define craft purely by result. So Cocoa Runners, Bar and Cocoa, Pump Street Dandelion, and Cocoa Eclectic, all makers or specialty retailers, converge on whole bean roasting, single origin or transparently sourced cacao, and a maker who's personally involved in production, often self-taught. I don't get why, if you want to be a craft maker, being self-taught is any kind of adjudicator of craftness or not. Prioritizing distinctiveness over consistency, yes, right? So at least I can agree on that, all right? Shaped by the producer's own skill, prioritizing distinctiveness over consistency, right? So the TLDR about all of that stuff is bean to bar process, small batch, traceable, minimal ingredients, flavor forward intent, which, right, and there's a genuinely resolved industry agreement about whether scale and ownership are essential criteria. I don't think that they are, right? So we're getting close to the end. And so I want to grab this from Chell, who is calling or watching from Scandinavia. Maybe the specialty chocolate community competitions do not need another 70% Pajofo, but a lot of customers have never tasted one. I'm pretty sure I would recruit new customers if I made one. So, Chell, I understand what it is that you're saying for, right? So you walk in and you go, oh, right, you've never tasted chocolate made from Madagascar beans, or you've never knowingly tasted chocolate from Madagascar beans. Here's a Madagascar, and it will, right? It will get some new customers for you. I think the point that I wanted to make is don't do Madagascar just because other people do Madagascar. And if you're gonna do Madagascar, understand what other people are doing with Madagascar and making sure that what you do with it, right, fits your ethos. Why are you making the chocolate? What are you doing? And so I think that's the important point that I make is don't do it just because other people do it, just because, oh, Madagascar is one of the most popular origins there is. Well, it's really, really interesting because Madagascar as a producing country is not necessarily the most popular. So, for example, in the 2018 European Bean to Bar round of the International Chocolate Awards, the producing country that won the most awards wasn't it wasn't Nicaragua, it wasn't Ecuador, it wasn't Venezuela, it wasn't any of the companies that come top of mind, especially around the FCIA research that had been done at the time. The country that produced the beans that were found in the most winners, right, was Nicaragua. Why? Because of Frizz Home. So Frizz Home entered a bunch of entries, won a lot of awards, and because of a single maker, right, the most popular producing country in the 2018 European Bean to Bar rounds was in fact Nicaragua, right, which doesn't make sense. If you looked at the Americas round, it was Ecuador because of Picari, directly because of Picari, right? And if you looked at the Asia rounds, it was Fuwan, right? So Taiwan was the number one producing country in the Asia Pacific round because of a single maker. And so we do need to understand that. And so if you're gonna do this, right, you need to do it for reasons other than I'm doing it just because everybody else does it. I'm not saying, Jell, that you would approach it that way. You and I have met, we've spent a lot of time talking. I've tasted a lot of your chocolate. I think you do everything very, very deliberately for those reasons. Right? But I don't see that in a lot of other makers, just so you know. I don't see that in every other maker, right? That consciousness of intent. Just a thought. Again, from David, sadly, many chocolate makers live comfortably with the false equivalent of craft equal ethical. Absolutely. That's another conflation, that false equivalence. Another way of thinking about it is all craft makers are ethical, right? Well, that's a rabbit hole that we could dive down and spend, weeks and weeks in the rabbit warren. I mean, if you're buying I think the best example of it, if I can, and getting it out of the craft arena is Tony's, right? So Tony's may own its bean supply chain in the sense that all of the beans that go into its chocolate are ones that it sources through Tony's open chain, although there's a fair trade component to everything that they're doing. Um, but their beans are transformed into butter and the beans are transformed into chocolate by Barry Callebaut. And so you can look at Tony's as a brand and say, oh my gosh, they're doing so much good, but you can't divorce, in my opinion, the relationship with Callebaut, right? You need to take that into account. And so many people might use bean to bar in the sense that they do it and think, oh, if I'm bean to bar, I must be ethical. Ghirardelli, ethical? Lint, ethical? I mean, it's a hard push, right? And we're going to be really diving deep into that concept generally on Friday, September 18th. The episode of Pod Safe Chocolate is going to celebrate, quote unquote, celebrate the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Harkin-Engel Protocol. I have two guests, Terry Collingsworth from International Rights Advocates, who's been a guest before, and Mickey Mastrati, who, among other things, is the producer of the movie, the documentary, The Dark Side of Chocolate, and then two or three sequels. And Mickey is also going to be joined on that day, and there may be others. So we're going to be talking, specifically about this notion of, can I make an ethical claim, right, around these sourcing kinds of questions? It's really, really important, right? So many chocolate makers live comfortably with the false equivalence of craft equal ethical without actually doing anything different from the big chocolate most criticized, right? And so I think that I think I'm going to say one important thing here, David, and I think it may have just, right. The point that I want to make here, which I think is important, it has to do with taking responsibility, right, rather than outsourcing. So there's this quote: "Is you can't divorce the ethics of production from the morals of consumption," right? So ethics being a social construct, broadly speaking, and morals being the internalization of how you live within this social construct, right? And so if you say my chocolate is ethical because my beans are Rainforest Alliance certified, or my chocolate is ethical because my beans are fair trade certified, what you've done is you've just outsourced everything to a third-party organization that you can't independently verify, right? And so that's a challenge, because if you say craft, it doesn't mean you're ethical right away. If you say craft, it doesn't mean you're direct trade. If it says craft and you're Rainforest Alliance certified, it doesn't mean you're ethical. You can't conflate the terms, which is what it is that I've been talking about. So aren't the definitions, Kurt asks, all going to be on a continuum? And without going into a very long discussion, because I've spent hundreds of hours of this over the last couple of years, and 20 to 30 hours over the last 2 weeks, noodling around this exact topics. Some of these definitions are going to be binary. You are or you not. So, right, I would say bean to bar is binary. You start with beans, you end with bars. Yes or no, right? It's when you start conflating, adding on things, where you get really, really, where it becomes confusing, right? Which is one of the reasons why I don't like doing it, right? So, so I have been doing a lot of work examining this exact question, right? So which one of these things are binary? There's another thing we haven't talked about, and it's the scalar idea, right? So you do have not just this intent continuum and this labor continuum, but you have this notion of size, which is a scalar, right? So which is, how do we find, so are we going to define nano batch, right? How big is nano, right? And that's on a scalar continuum, so a numerical continuum. So that's a different kind of continuum than intent, where there are no, I'm 50% craft, or I'm 40% craft. But you could say you're nano until you produce, if you work at 10 kilograms or less. You're micro if you work at 50 kilograms or less. You're mini so we can do that. I don't think it makes sense, but in that respect, yeah, right. Almost all definitions are a continuum, but there are some that are binary, right? Not all that many, but there are some that are in fact binary. And I would say that bean to bar is a binary definition. You are or you are not, right? So let's get to the last part of this. So types versus styles. So strictly speaking, if you go definitionally, a type is a legal category, right? If you go to CFR 21.163 here in the United States, we have sweet chocolate, we have milk chocolate, we have white chocolate. Those are types of chocolate, strictly speaking, right? Dark is not a type of chocolate legally because it fits within the definition of sweet chocolate. And so dark chocolate could be thought of as a style of sweet chocolate. And so it's really, really important that we understand what the difference is between a type of chocolate and a style of chocolate. And again, you know, Kurt, this is something that I've spent a lot of time working on. And rather than trying to reverse engineer the typology by saying, here are all these words that we use, I've gone to first principles and saying, how do we go about defining what the types of chocolate are based upon things like, you know, what are they made of, right? Or, you know, what the recipe is, and, you know, how much processing. So I've been working to develop this typology to try to get types of chocolate. And then you can have styles of chocolate. So a style of chocolate, again, dark chocolate could be a style of sweet chocolate, right? I could have I could have a milk chocolate, and I could have a 2-ingredient milk chocolate, just cocoa beans and milk powder. That's a style of milk chocolate, right? I have, right. So 2-ingredient isn't a type of chocolate, it's a style descriptor. I can have a 2-ingredient dark chocolate, I have a 2-ingredient milk chocolate. I can't have a 2-ingredient white chocolate. That's definitionally impossible, right? Because white chocolate is, right, milk, milk sugar, and cocoa butter, right? So I need at least 3 ingredients. So, but I can have a 3-ingredient milk chocolate. I can have a 3-ingredient dark chocolate. All of these things are possible. So these become styles, right, of the types of chocolate. And these things are, I think that definition is really, or that relationship is an important one to understand, right? So strictly, type is a legal category. I might argue that colloquially, dark is a separate type of chocolate, right? And if I were to do a formal typology of chocolate, which I am working on, I would separate out dark for a bunch of different reasons. Number one is that because the legal definitions for chocolate evolved over a very, very long period of time. So, for example, here in the United States, there's section 21.163, which is foods for human consumption, cacao products in the Code of Federal Regulations, wasn't added until 1977. The definition of white chocolate didn't come in until 2004. You know, that the categories or the types of chocolate that are legally described in 21.163 have been put into place in response to changes in the industry. Nobody sat down and said, okay, we're going to do this from first principles, right? And that might have been the intent back in 1977 to get as close as they possibly could, but it's just sort of grown mishmash willy-nilly over the past 50 years, right? And so that's why I would say, you know, do we need to be strictly legal? That's why I put strictly up there. Do we need to be strictly legal in terms of the types? Can we go colloquially? Does it make sense? And is it defensible to be able to move it that way? Really, really important. I mean, is it philosophically defensible to think of it that way? Or we're going to put together a structure that says this is what it's going to be, right? And so, you know, I can make a, you know, right, you know, if I look at sweet chocolate, it can have dairy products in it. So what's the difference between sweet chocolate, which is semi-sweet and bittersweet? What is it? How does it differ from milk chocolate? And it turns out it's the recipe, it's percentages for the most part. That's the primary difference. So it's a challenge to understand what the types are, and then to throw the styles in is another layer. But where I went with this and why I did it is that I said at the top, somebody said, can I create a new style of craft chocolate? And so is it possible to create a new style of craft chocolate? There's more in today's, you know, show notes, You can go read them. I'm going to come to here, and I'm going to go to sort of the conclusion because we're running a little bit long today. So is it possible to create a new style of craft chocolate? So if we use the definition for craft that I use, which is around intent, right? Rather than a new style, the style is, is direct trade craft chocolate a new style? Is single origin craft chocolate a new style? I mean, that makes no sense, right? To me, it doesn't make any sense. If we're going to sort of conflate craft chocolate and style in any meaningful kind of way. But if we think of style as a modifier to a type of chocolate, then it turns out to be trivially true, right? That we can create a new style of chocolate. And if it fits within the intent continuum, right? It fits at that end of the craft industrial continuum, then I've created a new style of craft chocolate, right? And so we've seen, I could say, well, I've got a Swiss style of dark chocolate, or a Swiss style of milk chocolate, right? Heavily conched, all the edges are rounded off. It's very smooth, right? The difference between sort of a Swiss style, which might be Northern European, which is one of my original definitions back in 2000, my original style definitions back in 2001, right? So you had a Northern European style of chocolate, which is Swiss and Belgian, and a Southern European style of chocolate, which was more France and Spain and Italy. And one way to think about the differences is Northern European tends to be lighter and sweeter, and Southern European tends to be darker and more intense, sort of like the difference between a cappuccino with sugar and an espresso, right? So those are different styles of chocolate. Could I create an Australian style chocolate? Yeah, I could just put together a bunch of different things and say, this is Australian style of chocolate. Taza created a new style of chocolate, a style that I call Pan-American, which was a combination of sort of the rustic nature of Mexican chocolate, coarse sugar and not fully refined cocoa, because it was going to be used to make a beverage, and we didn't need to get European style smoothness. And so they created something I call Pan-American, which combined what we think of as European smooth style with the Mexican rustic style, and creating a new style of chocolate. So it's not a new type of chocolate, because I can make this Pan-American milk, Pan-American dark, theoretically a Pan-American white. There are all ways to go about doing it. So it's trivially true. It is trivially true that we can create a new style, right? We need to give it a name, put together a set of characteristics, and this is what defines that style. Trying to conflate it with craft is it's a question which is, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to focus on craft. Okay? So as I get to the end, under this rubric, isn't it trivially easy to create a new chocolate style? And the answer is yes, it is trivially easier. I could create a New Zealand, a Kiwi style of chocolate. I could create an Australian style of chocolate. I'm going to define a Thai style of chocolate, a Vietnamese style of chocolate. I mean, again, trivially true to do all of those things. And I encourage people to be conscious, intent, right, on what it is they're doing, and to play with it, right? Because it's a lot of fun, because those are the ways in which craft chocolate is not boring. And with that, I'm going to end it there, because it seems like it's a good place to end today's stream. I want to thank Kurt and David for being a part of the conversation today. Thank you very much. Great questions, great comments. I appreciate them very, very much. Before I head out, this is the homepage of The Chocolate Life right now, right there. It is right there. If you are a member, if you're not a member, you can click, there's this green button here. Yours will say join if you're not a member. There's always a free membership tier, support the work that I do here. Been free since 2008 when The Chocolate Life was founded. If you do have the financial resources to support the work I'm doing, please, I appreciate it. It keeps Pod Safe Chocolate on the air. It pays for hosting and all the new development work that's being done on thechocolatelife.com, and gives me the option to buy upgrade the tech, microphones and lights and things like that that I use to produce these episodes. As I mentioned, this coming Friday, I'm going to be taking a look at the new specialty chocolate market research that was done by the Institute for Chocolate and Cocoa Research. I'm sorry if I misstated the name, but the ICCR, I'm going to be doing that. A week from today, we're going to be doing the August News and AMA. The monthly member AMA call is going to be on Friday, the 28th of August. Somebody's asked me, a lifetime member asked me to move it to Friday, so the weekends could be kept free. So that's going on for this coming Friday, or for Friday the 28th. And I want to say thank everybody who has subscribed to the PodSafe Chocolate YouTube channel. We hit the 1,000 subscriber mark, which is one of my goals for the summer. So happy to be there. But if you haven't liked the video, please do. If you're not subscribed to the PodSafe Chocolate channel on YouTube, please do. Your support makes everything a whole lot easier. And with that, I'm going to say thanks again to everybody who was in the stream, everybody who made a comment, everybody who's watched but didn't comment, and to remind everybody, if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you just might be doing it wrong. Until the next time, everybody, ciao.